Hello, everyone. Joe here again. Happy Saturday to all of you. Hope you're all doing well. Love to hear how you're doing in the chat box. Just, a little word or two about how you're feeling in general or in preparation for today's session. And today we're going to be talking about a delicate topic, a concept that doesn't have a normal frame. It's not a concept that gets talked about much. It's actually something like excuse me, grab my water. It's kind of a term that I have been playing around with in my own thinking about the world and that I haven't seen others really talk about. So I don't know if I'm the first one to use this concept of future Indigenous or if other people have, but I'll do my best to make clear why that's so relevant to talking about being on the design pathway for regenerating Earth in this time in history. So we'll be getting into that in a moment. Sorry, I needed a little drink of water there. But I would love just to hear how you're doing in the chat box. Just a little quick check-in. Are you feeling good? Are you happy? Are you distraught? Are you stressed? Are you curious? Are you motivated? Are you whatever you might be? Just would love to hear in the chat box how you're doing. So if you could drop that in, that would be great. And also, I have prepared a very simple poll for you to just start to gauge how we're doing, how we feel about this topic today. So my question for you in the poll, I'd love to see your answer, is, are you confused by the term future Indigenous? So it's just your own sort of internal senses. Do you kind of know what it is, or are you really not understanding it? Just wondering. And so far I'm seeing a whole bunch of people are not confused, which is really cool. JP, I'm glad you're with us. And if you fall asleep, come back and watch the replay tomorrow. I know it's very late. It's happy Sunday to you, JP. And Bob, I'm curious how your high school reunion went, because didn't you say that was the 50th, if I remember correctly? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit in an hour. And so, sorry, Jessica asked me a quick question. So I'm really excited today. Well, I don't know if excited. I'm actually, to be honest, I'm a little nervous about this topic because I know that, like I said a minute ago, that this concept of the future Indigenous is a concept that, as far as I know, I've made up, which means I've heard other related concepts from other people, but this is something I've just been thinking about myself and haven't seen in other places. And I know that for very important reasons in the social justice space, that this is a delicate topic. And so as a person of European descent with pale skin, without the melatonin that would make my skin darker, I fit into a category that makes this a topic that should be taboo. And what I actually want to do is go deeper underneath those social justice frames and look at this very interesting historical fact that every human being alive today is descended from Indigenous people, myself included. And so what do we do to recover our deep indigeneity? And how do we think about the past when we imagine it as though we've gone into the future and look backwards? And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation today with all of you. Because, well, Dan, I don't know. If you're either confused or you're not. So if you're like, I might be confused, then I'd still say you're confused. So it's okay. I wasn't really meaning to give like a really substantive discussion from the poll, just to get a sense from everyone. And so far, it seems like we're all generally at least feeling confident with the term, or at least the 9 of us who voted in the poll. So I'll be interested to see how this goes in the discussion. And so why wait? Let's just go ahead and jump right in. And as JP is saying in the chat, everyone is Indigenous to somewhere. And also, everyone is Indigenous to some when. which is an interesting part of the conversation today, where we'll think of the Indigenous of the past and the Indigenous of the future and how they may not be the same. And for very important reasons, I think they will need to be different. And so with that little prompt of provocation, let's jump in, shall we? So I'll start sharing my screen. And here we go. So the topic of today's discussion is becoming the future Indigenous. So we're not just talking about there being this idea of some past Indigenous and some future Indigenous, but that some part of humanity right now is going to become the ancestors of some Indigenous of the future. And that is presuming, of course, that humans don't go extinct. If humans go extinct, there's no future anything of humans, let alone an Indigenous culture. And so what we're really saying here is that when civilization killed off most of the ecosystems of the earth, and as that great song by Counting Crows goes, they cut down, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Here we're looking at the cracks in civilization and the new life that may emerge afterwards to say that there is some Indigenous of the future that survives this period of civilizations and empires that to a large extent has been very effective at destroying Indigenous cultures. Now I want to remind us of this slide we talked about in our very first session together, that as the human population overshoots and collapses, all of the unsustainable cultures will become compost for Earth's biosphere, but there will be some subset of humanity that maintains sustainability through the collapse. Or if we don't, that means that the population level has gone to zero and we've gone extinct. And our mission in these learning journeys in Earth Regenerators, in this design school for Earth Regeneration, is to join this green dotted line and to depart from civilization and its overshoot and collapse, and lay the foundations for a bridge to a regenerated planet and to sustainable cultures in the future. The thing I want to really express right now is that all civilizations collapse. This is just an empirical fact. Every single civilization in history has gone away. Every empire in history has gone away. The one that we have right now shows all signs of being deeply and profoundly unsustainable. And so we can safely predict that this civilization will collapse as well, or possibly has already begun. And so the important thing is that these civilizations and empires create compost. Where great cities once stood, reemerge the jungles, the forests, the grasslands, the natural ecosystems of the world that are held back by agriculture and that are held back by human civilization are able to flourish once more. And when we look at Indigenous cultures all around the world, we'll discover that rather than being anthropocentric or really focused on humans, they tend to be ecocentric, or they tend to have a worldview that is fundamentally ecological in nature. And this is captured beautifully in this quote: "When the blood in your veins returns to the sea, and the earth in your bones returns to the ground, perhaps then you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is you who belong to this land." Or in other words, your lifetime is just a period of being animated dust. And as the Old Testament says, it's ashes to ashes and dust to dust, and to dust we shall return, because we were never ever separate from the land. What this tells us in general terms is that an ecological worldview is based on this fundamental truth that all life is a web of relationships. And it is impossible to disentangle from this web without killing ourselves off. What we do to the web, we do to ourselves, as Chief Sealth famously said, the person whose name gave inspiration to the city of Seattle. So if we think of this separation, this departure from the civilizational fold to join the pathway of Earth regeneration, what we can say is that the descendants of regeneration will embody many elements of an Indigenous culture. And that means we can practice being ancestors to the future generations by beginning to practice and embody aspects of Indigenous culture now as part of our regenerative work. There's this great quote by Joanna Macy, who speaks very eloquently about what it's like to go to the perspective of our descendants and look backward in time and see them expressing gratitude for us doing what we need to do now. And she has this quote: "Future generations, if there is a livable world for them, will look back at the epochal transition we are making to a life-sustaining society, and they may well call this the time of the great turning." Now notice how she's suggesting that we see ourselves through the eyes of our unborn grandchildren as a way of seeing what kinds of ancestors we might be in the present. And it's this way of thinking, this flexibility of going forward in time and looking backward at ourselves, is how we want to imagine the future Indigenous. Earlier this week, Jessica, Elise, and I took a very powerful journey, walking down into part of the Chicamocha Canyon to the village of Pordan, and we visited this river. This river is Rio Chicamocha. Rio Chicamocha has carved the largest and deepest canyon in all of South America, and it happens to empty its waters along the edge of the plateau where Barichara is sitting. If you recall from previous images, Barichara is on a plateau, and there are 3 rivers that carve 3 of the sides of this plateau. Rio Chicamocha is one of those rivers. And in this scene that you see here, Elise and I are reaching down to touch the river. And we're teaching Elise that Rio Barichara is a person, is a presence, a sacred being who carved this landscape and brought life to it, who shaped the contours that the forest was born into. So what we've been doing with our daughter is practicing the art of gratitude to this sacred being known by the locals as Chicamocha. Here is Elise gathering stones and stacking them to make a ritual site. We did not tell her to do this. We didn't instruct her. We didn't guide her. All that we did is we built our own ritual site last year. And now when she came here and we said, let's pay our respects and our thank yous to Chicamocha. And I asked Elise to say, Elise, what do you want to say to Chicamocha as a way of saying thank you? And Elise said, Chicamocha, I love you. That's what Elise said. And then, without any prompting from us, she began to gather these rocks and to stack them as a way of preparing a ritual space for the river. You see, our children can learn how to seek these healthy relationships with landscapes if we as their parents teach them Indigenous practices. Now, Jessica grew up in the Chicago suburbs, and I grew up on an industrial chicken farm in Missouri. We were not born into an Indigenous culture, and yet we know enough about Indigenous cultures to know that treating the landscape as a peopled landscape, that there are river people and rock people and forest people and animal people, we can teach this to our children, which is what we're doing when we visit Chicamocha and offer our thank yous and offer gifts of gratitude, or what in Spanish is called pagamentos. And here is our daughter building a ritual site in service to a river. Here's a picture of another ritual site that Elise made at Origen del Agua, the nature reserve that we were able to purchase with crowdfunding with money from the Earth Regenerators community. Now, we had built our own pagamentos ritual site, and Elise gathered some of those stones and then some stones of her own. And every time we come here, she brings more stones to this place, and Elise has created her own ritual space, making the land sacred at Origen del Agua so that we can bring the water back to this desert land and bring the forest back to life. And again, Jessica and I were not born into an Indigenous culture, but there's nothing to stop us from practicing the Indigenous mindset of treating ecological relationships as sacred and then teaching it to our children. So when we were camping at our friend's campsite, when we didn't have a home for 2 months earlier this year, Elise and I, and Jessica too, but Elise and I did it alone a few times, would walk up this dirt road that had a bunch of fossil rocks on it. And I called it Calle de los Ancestros, the road of the ancestors. And we gathered these fossil stones. We gathered our ancestors from the ancient ocean when we told Elise that everyone on land evolved from grandparents that came out of the ocean. So Elise helped gather these fossil rocks. She's learning how to treat the land as sacred while also seeing the ecological connections, that the ocean floor is now at the top of a mountain, leaving ancestors buried in the rocks. And that if we carry these rocks to the Origen del Agua, our ancestors will be sitting there blessing the land, and we can visit our ancestors where we do our reforestation work. But there's a lot that the indigenous cultures of the past didn't have. And this is one thing that they didn't have. They did not have the cosmological story told to us by science that tells us that 13.7 billion years ago, there was a big bang and the universe came into being. And space and time themselves expanded out in a forward linear direction, creating increasing complexity as time went by to form the first generation of stars that grew, that lived full multi-billion year lives, exploded and died, and in the remnants of them came second generation stars, planets and asteroids, comets and so forth, forming the Earth and the Sun and all of the other planets we know of. And this developmental story of big history is something indigenous people didn't have, but it's something we can depend upon to say there is now so much converging evidence that this is true that we can start to see what is shared among all of us. And one thing that's shared across all human cultures is all of us are born of stars. We're all the remnants of dead stars reformed into planets and brought life only in precious, rare circumstances that are being exposed by the field of astrobiology and other related fields. At least there's nothing to listen to right now. Here's my headphone if you want to listen to. But you're not going to hear anything for a while. It's just me talking. And this is really important because this allows us to take all of the different cosmologies of the different cultural histories and place them within this cosmological story. Another thing that all indigenous cultures of the past did not have is our ancestors never saw the entirety of Mother Earth from space. That took an astronaut in the late 1960s and then the launch of satellites into space in the early 1970s to start taking these photographs so that we could see the entire planet and have a mental image of the blue marble. This is a new phenomenon that didn't exist before, and no indigenous culture before the 1960s was able to see the Earth from space. This allows us to see our common history and our common ancestry with all life on Earth and with all humans in particular. See, the scientific worldview, for all of its flaws, gave rise to a linear story of evolution, where the linear part is that there's a timeline of history, and the past is continuing to be replaced by a new present as we march endlessly into the future. And this enables us to hold all of humanity as one family. So now we can see our great mother and see how the Earth creates the conditions for life at the planetary scale. We've talked about the planetary boundaries framework as a cautionary tale, but underlying it is the most sophisticated integration of human knowledge ever attempted in what's known as the Earth System Sciences, which is the incredible amount of complex knowledge we now have about our home planet and how our planet supports life. And this is exactly the knowledge we need to be regenerative designers. Also, many indigenous cultures of the past viewed time as a repeating circle, with cycles of the moon or cycles of the sun or cycles of the seasons. So they didn't necessarily see time changing, going from the past to the future, but rather the time moved in cycles that repeated themselves. And this is something that is contradicted by the scientific story. And we have evidence to tell us that the moon cycles are embedded within a larger linear story of evolution, but that these circles in linear time create spirals. Also, because indigenous cultures of the past were always only locally embedded, they could tell the history of their own people and treat other peoples, other tribes, as being less than human or non-human. Now, not all tribes did this, but many of them did, and there was quite a lot of warfare between tribes throughout all of human history. Now, I'm not saying here that humans are consistently violent, but that violence and warfare are definitely a part of our history. And part of that history is we did not have an evolutionary story that told us all humans are part of the same family. Each culture had its own origin story, its own history of humanity, and its own ways of defining who was in humanity and who was not. But now that we have this universe story as an unfolding spiral with a single direction in time, we also have convergent evidence that all humans come from the same ancestral line, which means we now know through genetic markers that we have some genes from Neanderthals because some of our ancestors actually interbred with them. But this also tells us that all modern humans, which includes every indigenous culture on Earth, all come from the same family. So we are a planetary species with a planetary history embedded within a universe story. And the blending of this scientific story with indigenous practices, like treating a river as sacred, are part of what we can start to see as a difference between the indigenous of the past and the indigenous of the future. See, here's the thing. The future indigenous, the people who survive after the present moment, will be survivors from the death of the Holocene, this 12,000 year period of warm, stable climate when all empires and civilizations existed. No cities existed outside of the Holocene, no civilizations, no empires, no agriculture. We have no evidence that any of these things can exist outside of the Holocene, and the Holocene is now over. So if they're indigenous of the future, we can't simply presume that the practices that carried them forward before the Holocene or during it are going to work. See, the big difference now is that we've achieved planetary scale. So the indigenous of the future will need to hold the entire planet in their hearts in ways that the ancestral indigenous didn't have to. So I created this simple visual representation of the levels of reality we need to hold in place. The first one is the foundation of it all. No matter which culture you're in, to be a regenerative culture, you need to have an ecological worldview that sees a web of relationships that are all interdependent with each other. This ecological worldview gives rise to every kind of indigenous spirituality. It turns out that indigenous spirituality is consistent with a lot of what we know in science. And it is science that has enabled us to understand our Mother Earth and how our planet creates life. And so what we need to do is create this thread through from above to below and back and forth that says what we know about Mother Earth, informed by science, needs to be made consistent with indigenous spirituality so that we can live within cultures grounded in an ecological worldview. And this blend has never existed in human history. It is not part of the past indigenous. And if there are indigenous of the future, I would argue that it must be part of their cultures. And we can make the claim that humans might accidentally survive the coming collapses and accidentally become regenerative, but they might have a civilization rise again that does the same thing that's happening now. To avoid that happening, we need to maintain as much of this knowledge as we can in continuity with the future to become a planetary species that serves the homeostasis of the entire biosphere. Back to the territory where we live in Barichara, Colombia. The indigenous Guane people who lived here before the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they treated this river as sacred as well. And they could also walk into the same valley we walked into and understand the ecological importance of this river. They most certainly did understand this. And they could walk the contours of the entire territory, as we know they did because we walked on the stone paths and the footpaths of these indigenous people to go to the river earlier this week. But the Guane people never saw the shape of the northern Andes. and they never saw the drainage into the Amazon to their east. That required maps and satellite data and the kinds of images like this one I pulled off of Google Maps. Now, we take these maps for granted today, but it has only been possible to view maps like this for a few hundred years for parts of the world, and from outer space, only for the last 40 years. Also, only in the last 40 years have we known what the Earth looks like from space. And only in the last 40 years have we agreed, or at least the scientific community came to agreement, that plate tectonics is real and continents move around and there's only one ocean. And it's the same ocean connecting all of the land masses on Earth in the same planetary system. And this is knowledge that the indigenous people of the past did not have. They might have been able to infer parts of it, but we have it as confirmed knowledge through rigorous critical analysis and debate among a large number of people with a huge diversity of methods and data, all pointing at the same information. So this new planetary perspective is a key element of what separates the past indigenous from the future indigenous. Also, our ability to see the Earth in 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions in space and 1 dimension in time, which is something we're able to do with computer simulations. This is very new and very important. What I'm showing here is a climate simulation of aerosols flying around in the atmosphere as the Earth turns, watching an annual pulse of Northern Hemisphere summer and winter as we go through a 1-year cycle. And you can watch the greening come up and down, and you can watch the ice go down and up as we finish this annual cycle. This ability to see in space and time with rigor that what we know we're seeing is either correct or we can use other evidence to show it's incorrect. This ability to see in 4 dimensions is brand new. And if we combine this incredible power of computer simulation and what's called scientific visualization, if we combine that with things like plant medicine and other sacred practices of indigenous people, then we can come to a compassionate place of care and stewardship for what we learn from science about how the planet works. And for me personally, my shamanic training was earth system science. I came to love and care for the earth by learning what these patterns represent. So the future indigenous will be a blend of current knowledge and traditional practice. And I would argue, as we've been talking the whole time, that this needs to be organized around the bioregions of the earth. So while the cultural evolution of indigenous people in the past always self-organized to the scale of bioregions, civilizations and empires did not. And now we have to intentionally design for bioregional scale to survive what's happening and be resilient and sustainable in the future. And what's interesting is because bioregionalism is what indigenous people did before, if we become bioregional now, we will become the ancestors of indigenous people in each bioregion where we do this work. And again, I can show you what this means where we live here in Colombia. There are local food networks with campesino farmers with lots of native plants. And so when we gather this native food, like you see here on the right, I have a stone mortar and pestle, hand carved by an artisan in the village of Guane. And what are we grinding? We're grinding cacao, the sacred bean of the cacao tree, what is used to make chocolate. This is an indigenous medicinal plant, and we use it to make chocolate. And here we are engaging in food processing by hand with local food as an indigenous person would have done in the past. Also, because many indigenous food practices are still here among the campesinos of this region, we can engage in education to preserve this cultural knowledge and pass it on to younger generations, meaning we can preserve indigenous culture. And we can blend it with modern scientific knowledge where it's appropriate to do so. And as we do this, we create resilience and solidarity among the local campesinos, and those of us who are not from here that have moved here, like my family, can participate with them to reforest the territory, to bring the rivers back to life, and to preserve this cultural knowledge. The same would be true in any other bioregion. Similarly, there are local craft skills. Like here in the upper left, there's a workshop where middle schoolers are learning bioconstruction with mud, clay, and with rocks, which is how a lot of buildings are constructed here in this village. Also, there's a lot of ancestral knowledge about local plants and how to make weaving for baskets and clothing, and that is still here, like these baskets you see on the right. And this picture on the bottom, that's our friend Alejo and our friend Felipe's son Alun, and they are helping to dig a water retention project with our supervision in the Bioparque. So we're bringing permaculture, which is a blend of modern ecological science and agricultural practices, together with agroecology and indigenous practices, in a place where we're bringing the two worlds together to regenerate a landscape. So the lesson here is, we only become ancestors if our descendants survive. And I say this as Elise is sitting in my lap. I also declare full and forthright, the future Indigenous will be bioregional, just as all past Indigenous were. So the question for us is, how do we honor the past while regenerating for the future when we preserve this vital knowledge from the modern era, and it came from civilizations? Much of it is knowledge to be composted from genocide of indigenous peoples. How do we do this? This is a delicate, complex, and multifaceted question, and a vital part of living into the design pathway for regenerating Earth. So that's it. I'd love to have a conversation with all of you about this. I know this is a really important topic, and one that I'm excited to explore with all of you for the next half hour and in the coming days and weeks.
Can you help me put this on?
Yeah, I can help you put this on. And Elise was sitting in my lap the whole time. So Elise is here, and she wants her headphones while I wear my headphones. So I'd love to get into this discussion with all of you. Actually, Elise, this goes better on this side, I think. Well, Elise puts in some earbuds that don't fit. At least they're too big for you. They don't fit. But if you want one of my earbuds, you can listen as we're talking to our friends. Do you like that? Because then I'll start talking
No,
about you.
I want to change headphones.
No, I need to use these to be able to hear, and those don't work. And I want to give everyone attention. So as you can see, this idea of the future Indigenous is not a delicate topic. It's a very, very serious topic. And I see Tara saying something about viewing the Earth from the sky. Even if they did view the Earth from the sky, they didn't view it from satellites from space. And they certainly didn't view the entire solar system and all of our planets, or the Oort cloud, the sphere of comets that's surrounding our solar system, and so on. There's this incredible body of scientific knowledge that is deeply congruent, deeply resonant with Indigenous knowledge and practices. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about all of this. And I love to start a conversation. I see the first question is by Gail Burkett. So I'll invite Gail onto the screen. And Gail asks, you've been thinking about this for a long time. How has your behavior on the ground and Barichara changed you as a young father to create your own future Indigenous self? Oh, what a beautiful question. So I hope Gail's able to join me, because I think Gail's gonna have some beautiful thoughts on this. Yay, you are. Hello, Gail, how are you? I'm gonna put the earphone over to Elise so she can hear you too. I want to hear. Here, Elise, headphones in.
Okay.
Hello.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Testing, testing.
Somebody help me.
Testing, testing.
Okay.
What about now?
Did that work?
What about now?
No.
It's okay, we'll get it figured out.
Sorry.
I'll just make noise so that you know that I'm here. At least, do you want to say anything in case Gail is able to hear us? What about now?
Hi.
No? Well, Elise, is there anything you'd like to tell everyone about what you heard Daddy talking about? You want to tell everyone about Chikamocha or about something else?
Okay, skip over it. Okay.
Testing, testing. Gail, are you there? Oh, she's trying to connect. Well, while Gail is trying to connect and we're having technical problems, I really want to say that in answer to her question, I think what we've been doing since Elise was born is going from realizing we needed to make deep changes to being like Alice in Wonderland and just going down the rabbit hole. And that this has taken us closer and closer to Indigenous perspectives. And we still have a long way to go. But one thing that's been amazing about being here in Colombia is there are still about 80 Indigenous languages spoken in Colombia alone, and more than 100 Indigenous cultures that are still intact and are still, they don't have, many of them have blended with the modern world and are not, prior to contact. None of them are prior to contact. But there is still a huge amount of knowledge and existing cultural practices that we can draw from, and that we do draw from. And actually the mochila that I use, that little like a woven bag I had slung over my shoulder, is in the style of the Guane people, made from a local plant called fique, which is something that the native people of this region used. And so we actually practice using the artifacts and the handcrafts of the indigenous people to help us learn how to be more indigenous. And I would say that it's now permeated every aspect of our lives. Doesn't mean we've made changes in every aspect of our lives, but it means that we either have made changes or we will as these changes continue to percolate within us. And Elise is being a goofball, so I'm going to touch her nose. There we go. And Elise, if you want to say anything at any time, you're welcome to. Such an important question, Gail, and we can continue touching on it as we go. I see we have a question here from Alpha, where he says, in the integral theory spiral dynamics model, would you say at the yellow level of development, humanity is the level where it would embrace becoming indigenous? Alpha, I don't know if you're still there. I tried to invite you on the screen, but I don't know if it worked. Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with integral theory and spiral dynamics, they use colors to represent different stages of human psychological development, which we can connect to things like the ability to hold complexity, to the ability to hold paradox, different levels of ethical reasoning and moral sentiment. And one thing Alpha is talking about here is going above the tribal level. But Alpha, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe you can unpack the question a little bit more.
Yeah, so kind of like modern culture is at this orange level, which is very science-based, business-based, kind of capitalism. And then green is a level where you become very environmentally aware and you realize, okay, we're doing a lot of things wrong. Yellow is kind of the level where I'm still trying to get clear on the yellow, but I think it's where you can actually see different paradigms and you're able to hold the ability that multiple people are different paradigms, and you're also now able to integrate different paradigms. So while people are green, they know that we're doing something wrong and that we need to, they don't exactly know how to shift the culture. Whereas at yellow, you're actually learning to actually integrate body and mind and different things, because you have that paradigmatic flexibility. And so you're actually learning not just to think that we need to be right, but actually shift your way of being so that you are living in tune with nature. And at least that's what my guess of what yellow is. And so that's what I'm thinking, maybe at yellow, but I don't fully understand yellow enough to say if that's where it is.
Yeah.
Where it integrates.
I mean, what I would say is a key element of this level called yellow is the ability to see multiple perspectives that have contradictory truths, where the truth of one perspective contradicts another, and be able to see that both of them are true within their perspective. To be able to look at one perspective and say, within this perspective, I see this as true, but it doesn't account for this other thing. But which means it's not completely true. It's not universally true. It's contextually true from the perspective, but another perspective has a different idea of truth. And what's important about this is, let's take something like, is something good or bad ethically? We might say, for example, it's ethically bad to eat meat that is part of our industrial agricultural system. But we might also say that it's not inherently bad to eat meat. And those two truths are coming from, because we might say, for example, within a context where we're hunting an animal in a forest with a small human population, with technologies that aren't so powerful they could wipe out an entire herd, then maybe I could take a bow and arrow and shoot an elk. And eating the meat is not, it's not clear cut that it's bad. It might be good. And so this ability to see both perspectives are true within their context is part of being at the yellow level. And then the ability to kind of be agile and moving back and forth between perspectives and integrate them to get to higher level truths, which can include transcending or even just holding a paradox, which is hard to do. What I think is important for the discussion today is that I don't think everyone needs to have that capacity to be a participant in an indigenous system, because indigenous systems would have humans at different stages of psychological development, but more that those who are designers of the ethical aspects of this transition will probably need to be at the yellow level to be able to hold multiple perspectives and do whole system design that is applying to more than one perspective at once. But I'm not absolutely certain that's correct, but I think it's probably correct. What do you think about that? What is that?
Well, I think at Green, you're starting to say, okay, there's this kind of multicultural thing. We're going to accept all cultures, but you don't know exactly how to integrate them all. So at Yellow, you're able to both hold multicultural perspectives and also know how to integrate it into a functioning system. And so this functional system seems like we need to be more indigenous. And but that's actually, if you're kind of at the multi or relativistic stage, you're kind of saying, okay, both are important. We need to be capitalism. We need to like cherish capitalism, and we need to cherish living with the land or something. But maybe at the Yellow, you actually realize our whole civilization is messed up if we actually don't become more indigenous. So even though you're able to see both perspectives, you know that you're able to select which is the best path forward. So, and you may be able to see that we actually have to become more indigenous, even though it's extremely painful to transition out of a lot of our modern day culture.
Yeah, I'd maybe say that those of us who are really deeply trying to become regenerative will become closer and closer to indigenous practices, but we won't hold the false competition that says science is always bad and indigenous is always good, which would be a lower level, especially when you look at how many scientific mystics there were, like Albert Einstein to be a nice example. There was the idea that science and technology are equivalent is a common misunderstanding of science. I see a question that Gail had asked in the chat, and I wanted to just show. She had asked, what do we put in our pockets as we're walking around? And I want to show this rock that I found on the Calle de los Ancestros. This is actually a fossil rock I found here in the territory. And what's amazing for me about this that relates to what Alpha and I are talking about right now is I can, as a scientist, go and study rock formation and geology and earth history and learn how this rock formed. And as a spiritual practice, I can observe that it's shaped like the fertility goddess, or it might be shaped like a phallus, or it could be part of a ritual artifact that I use, like something I use in a ceremony. And I can go back and forth between the spiritual perspective and the scientific perspective by operating at the Yellow level, this level of working across worldviews.
Yeah,
And
I actually want to say, yeah, I'm very into that. And in fact, I've written a book called Physics of Expanded Consciousness. So, because I'm a physicist working in trying to bridge physics and spirituality. And yeah, there are actually meetings between physicists and indigenous people. There's a I forget the name of it. But anyway, they bring together a lot of a lot of tribal people with the physicists, and it's a really cool conference.
Yeah, but thanks for the question, Alpha. We'll all be chewing on this, like how much psychological capacity do humans have to be able to see ourselves as the future indigenous, and then actually to embody it. Ooh, that's a good topic to keep talking about. So thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Let's jump over to another question here. I see we have two of them asked at the same number of votes. So I'll go to Bob and then to Tara. And Bob's question, Bob, I'll invite you onto the screen, saying, since most humans now believe in science, is there a way that we can get science to make perfectly clear that deep ecology is the knowledge base that it is really trying to teach us, to make them believe it? Well, I'd be cautious about trying to convince anyone of anything, because there's good scientific evidence for why that doesn't work very well from the cognitive behavioral sciences. That said, the point you're getting at about deep ecology and science, I think this is a really important one. And I'd just love to hear your perspective on how you see deep ecology and science being resonant with each other, or maybe which parts of science are in resonance with deep ecology. Like, what were you thinking of here?
I wasn't looking at anything specific necessarily. I was looking more at a big picture that, ever since agricultural society started and we started overrunning things and becoming the dominant species and all that kind of stuff and not living as indigenous anymore for the most part, so that as science has built up during that time, specifically more the last 500,000 years or so, but that it's that the spiral that it's causing is to actually, not to close the circle. We don't want to go back to exactly where indigenous was before. We can't, but it becomes a spiral then, so that we take all that knowledge from the last 400 to 800 years and brings it back to a new level to teach us what that new indigenous is. And that since we are science-based now and more people trust science-based and don't have that direct knowledge of deep ecology and stuff, that if we want to try and get a more of a mass of people to maybe understand what's actually going on and to make some moves, maybe somehow make them see, well, that's what science is really trying to teach you. You believe in science? If we could actually put a pattern together and say, this taught you this, taught you this, taught you this, and start making that spiral to where it came back to ecology, then I think we could get more people going than just trying to teach them to become more aware of ecology and build from there.
Yeah, I think of a couple of really good teachers who have done this for a lot of people, like Fritjof Capra has done this. He has taught a metaphysics of shamanic spirituality connected to the knowledge of, for example, that everything in the universe is basically moving energy, and that a lot of the ritualistic metaphors of spirituality in many cultures are very much what quantum mechanics says. It's like the same.
Yeah, I read the Tao about 25 years ago, I guess, 30 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, me too. It was about 25 years ago. It changed my world. Yeah. And another example is it Stefan Harding at Schumacher College, who helped create the Center for Holistic Science. And he was a biology, or like a field ecology biologist studying deer. And he's from England, so he's in the countryside of someplace in England. And he realized that all the data he gathered about these deer told him nothing. Like in his scientific papers, he didn't say anything about the interpersonal experience he had when the deer looked at him and he looked at the deer and they had a moment of connection. And he could tell he was looking at another intelligent being. Yet Animate Earth, that Jan is tagging in the chat, is a fantastic book. Thank you for mentioning that, Jan. It's a great book. That there are many people in the scientific world who have taken this holistic perspective. Obviously, science itself is embedded in the disciplinary silos of universities and the funding silos of modern societies. So there are a lot of problems, but there's quite a lot in science that moves toward mysticism in a way that's very resonant with indigenous practice. And I definitely see these as being connected as well. In both directions, you can do earth rituals with children and teach them science. Like you can teach them things about basic ecology, for example. And in the other direction, you can learn science, tell the universe story, and become, have your mind blown by learning that your body is stardust, and then go do mushrooms or ayahuasca or whatever, and have your spiritual awakening and recognize that they're getting you to the same place. But I think the embodied experience is really important in this. And that's one thing that scientific practice is pretty bad at, this false view of objectivity that tries to separate us from what we study when we need to be interpersonal with what we're working on. Other thoughts? I know I just rambled there. Sorry, I just started going.
That's okay. No, you're talking almost like a gotcha moment, like, and that's what I'm trying to get at too, is that there's enough people that believe in science just by itself that if you could find something that was that gotcha moment when you're looking in Ishmael's eyes and you see somebody else there, that's not you. And also all of a sudden you got you and said, well, but science brought me here, made me see this. And now I can go explore it from the other point of view coming back. Maybe
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So,
A good example of this is the overview effect, which is a psychological gestalt change that happened for astronauts when they looked at the Earth from space.
mhm.
And I have a dear friend named Kevin Kelly, not the same one from Wired magazine, although I know him too. There's another Kevin Kelly who created this amazing picture book called The Home Planet. And it's a collection of photographs of the Earth taken from space with quotes from spacewalkers or people who went into orbit, astronauts and cosmonauts and people from all over the planet, where they describe how they fell in love with the Earth by seeing it from space, when science and technology is what made it possible for them to go up there. But they had these surprisingly spiritual experiences, and many of them were atheists. And so, so there's something to it. There's really something to it. How science is touching the same elephant as spirituality. Great stuff. We got lots to chew on here, don't we?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I know we had a question here from Tara. Let me jump over to that one. Tara's got this one. What about the dependence on our wider degenerative economy for the science that you speak about? This is a really important one, which is how do we take things that grew out of degenerative culture and help them create regenerative culture? And this actually goes into a space that is not surprising once we name it, which is grief and trauma. Most of us can't go there because we're not done grieving yet, and we reactivate our trauma. So for example, if I'm thinking about atomic bombs being, Tara, were you trying to get on the screen or I see that you rejected. Okay, so you don't want to come on the screen, or do you want me to try and invite you again? Just let me know for inclusion's sake. But basically, the ability to see science as the pursuit of knowledge through a set of methods that are quite powerful. And at the same time, recognizing a key part of science is the sociological dimension of people critiquing each other's assumptions to consistently etch away at false understandings. And one of the key things about science is that it does help us get closer to an understanding of what is true. What's interesting about this is when we combine it with spiritual practices. If we have embodied spiritual practices, that we actually can get to a variety of experiences that take us to deeper feelings of confidence that what we know is correct, to enable us to take actions that historically, from a spiritual point of view, would have required faith. And while faith is an important thing in many spiritual traditions, it's actually part of a system of control in a lot of colonial religions. And so it's really interesting to take an idea like reincarnation and then think about what Darwinian evolution says, which is that your body's going to die and decompose and become the food for life for some other organism. And your matter, the matter that is your body, which is constantly changing while you're alive, just changes into other forms of life and is constantly incarnating life. And the scientific story doesn't negate it at all, just gives a twist to it. So anyway, it's a very interesting topic. And I hope Tara is able to join me and have some discussion of this. But what I think is really important here is, while we have a dependence on, for example, fossil fuels for a lot of our scientific practices now, that doesn't mean that science is going to require fossil fuels. Science emerged as a set of institutional practices before fossil fuels were discovered. But what's interesting is a lot of indigenous practices, like saying how an indigenous person learns the uses of a plant, or how they learn to track a specific animal to be able to hunt it, is actually the scientific method, meaning that they gather information, they look for patterns, then they have hypotheses about the pattern, Then they try little experiments. They do things to see if the pattern actually works the way they think it does. And then they adjust their understanding based on the feedback they get from that empirical experiment. So you see that there's this really important way that a lot of indigenous knowledge is developed in the same way as science. Now, there's not peer review. They don't have high energy particle accelerators, specific instruments of science. But this way of learning and engaging in the world is part of how humans learn and engage in the world. That's just been made more, like it's been honed and pruned to take away the parts that don't work and keep primarily, not only, but primarily the parts that do. And yeah, as Tara's saying here about traditional ecological knowledge is scientific and peer-reviewed, absolutely. And similarly, if you look at someone like Richard Evans Schultz, one of the great ethnobotanists, that he helped create the field of ethnobotany, which is very scientific, by traveling to mostly Colombia, traveling to the Andes and the Amazon, and doing ayahuasca and doing mushrooms and doing lots of things with the shamans, and then coming back and scientifically studying it and doing both. And so there's something really important about combining these perspectives. So I don't see any other questions here. I'm wondering if there are any other questions. And I see Gail's bringing up art and science as having a similar relationship, which I totally agree. And what I'd like to invite, since we're also getting close to the hour here, is this idea of the future indigenous at a general level is if humans don't go extinct, our descendants will be bioregional, and their cultures will be much more like ancestral indigenous cultures than like a civilization. But also, those of us trying to live regeneratively now can practice indigenous practices and pass them on to our children, which is a kind of cultural indigenous ancestor, which is I may not be in the bloodline of a specific culture. Like, for example, Jessica and I gathered rocks from Rio Chicamocha, carried them to Orihuela, and this morning we offered them as gift offerings of gratitude. We learned that ritual of taking a rock from the river and carrying it to the place up high where you want water to be on the land. That's a Kogi practice, the Kogi people of Santa Marta. And so we learned a practice from the Kogis, and then we practiced that ritual and we taught it to our child. So we don't have to be in the bloodline of the Kogis to share a cultural meme from their culture through our family and into our child, because we did that this week. And we're bringing indigenous culture in when we do this. And there's a big discussion we can have about purity and whether we do it absolutely correctly, whether it's authentic enough. And that's a very important discussion. But at a more general level, what we're doing is trying to be more like an indigenous family because we see that as a way of creating a regenerative culture. And we're practicing that very consciously because there's a lot of anthropology research showing that all sustainable cultures in history were indigenous. There's zero non-indigenous cultures. Like if you take cultures that are sustainable, cultures that are non-sustainable, all sustainable cultures were indigenous. Some indigenous cultures are non-sustainable. All civilizations and empires, unsustainable. The only sustainable cultures with evidence in history are sustainable, are indigenous. So if we try to create indigenous cultures now, we're going to be practicing a lot of indigenous things. And if we become bioregional, then it's local plants, local building materials, local ways of making clothing, and that becomes more like an indigenous lifeway. So this is what I mean by the future indigenous, is that this is a very delicate and subtle process, but it's also, in my view, an essential process. We have to do it thoughtfully, but we cannot avoid doing it. We either do it badly and still partially succeed, or we don't do it at all and we don't succeed. And this is my understanding based on what I know of indigenous cultures and what I'm learning by practicing living bioregionally while helping regenerate a territory as we learn the indigenous practices. And so I hope this is something that you think about and reflect on. If you want to come to me with questions, come to me with challenges and critiques, please do. I welcome all of them. Would love to have this conversation. And also we'll be able to talk about this in the Zoom calls tomorrow and Monday. So thank you all for being here today. and for participating in this conversation. And I look forward to more. So yeah, fumbling our way forward, JP, exactly. Thank you all, and onward, fellow humans.